Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Jocelyn Goldfein, and I am delighted to welcome you to Zetta Bytes Live. I'm one of the partners here at Zetta, where we back AI native startups, and we love helping founders turn AI inventions into commercial successes. We believe that technology powered by data will reshape the enterprise as we know it, and we've started Zetta Bytes Live to tell those stories. We're featuring deep dives in the state of the art in AI platforms, showcasing successful applications of AI with top industry leaders. And today I have not one, but two special guests who are leading experts on responsible AI. And Joaquin, Terah, if you could turn your cameras on and join us. I'm so excited about today's panel. Terah is the founder and former director of the Partnership in AI, a global nonprofit that creates resources and best practices for the responsible use of AI. And before the partnership, she was a policy advisor to the Office of Science and Technology Policy under Obama. And she guided some of the earliest thinking on policy controls for AI and machine learning. And even more exciting than that, she is the newest member of the Zetta team because she's joined us earlier this year as an EIR. Welcome, Terah, to Zetta and to the Zetta Bytes Live. And together with Terah, we have Joaquin Quiñonero Candela. Joaquin recently left Facebook after over 9 years, so he actually overlapped with me long ago, and is now a senior fellow at the Harvard Belfer Center. And his last role at Facebook was he was the distinguished technical lead for responsible AI, and he oversaw the technical strategy for fairness, inclusion, privacy, and much more. And before that, he built and led Facebook's applied ML team, which means he created the platform that supported all of Facebook's production use of AI internally, and Facebook really was one of the first movers of production use of AI. So that pretty much makes him one of the world's foremost experts. And Joaquin also was Facebook's representative on the board of the Partnership in AI, which is how he and Terah got to know each other and why we're bringing them together for this first joint Zetta Bytes Live. Terah, Joaquin, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. You two had extremely different paths, but you have both ended up passionate about this same mission, the responsible development of AI technology. Can each of you talk about what brought you to the field? Was there an it moment where you knew these were problems you had to work on? Maybe start with Joaquin.
Yeah, thank you, Jocelyn, and hi, everyone. Thank you for having us here. It's awesome to be joined by two good friends. I think the arc that brought me to responsible AI started a long time ago, but it wasn't a straight line. I think I first did, when I decided to do a PhD in machine learning that I started back in 2001, I was focused more on the math side of things. And compared to today, I was spending a lot more time on the whiteboard, deriving equations, both to describe models and to train them and so on. Then later on in my career, I joined Microsoft Research in Cambridge in the UK in 2007, and that was a very important moment because that exposed me to applications of ML at Microsoft. And so I started to work on click prediction using machine learning to optimize the delivery of ads. And I just became really fascinated and obsessed with the idea of shipping ML into products, and I never looked back. So that defined the rest of my career. And then, of course, when I joined Facebook, that's what I did. Initially, I started in ads, and then, as you said a moment ago, I built the applied ML team for the entire company, and then sort of built the responsible AI team. But there were many moments in the journey where I asked myself questions. One example was when working on predicting clicks on ads at Microsoft. One of the questions that kept coming into my mind was, well, what input signals are okay to use? Is it okay to use gender as an example? And the interesting thing is back then, and we're talking about 2009 or 10, and no one had a good answer to that question. No one had any idea. It wasn't yes or no. It was like, we don't know. Later on at the New York's conference, the Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency workshop was started probably around 2014 or so. In the beginning, most of us were looking at thinking like, what is this thing for? And then a couple of years later only, I thought, oh my God, this is the most important thing I should be working on.
Excellent. Terah, how about you?
I had a different journey, but mine was also nonlinear, as Joaquin described his. I started actually working on robotic applications for environmental science. So originally, actually, I was really privileged to study a sort of Frankenstein multidisciplinary mix of quantitative social sciences, really driven by CS, and also philosophy was an undergrad interest of mine as well. So very early on, I was very interested in sort of normative questions about technology. And that work actually directly intersected me with the policy world because a lot of what I was working on at the time were unmanned aircraft systems or drones, which are very understandably a very controversial application of AI and robotics technology. And in order to get permission to fly, both in Cambridge, US, where we were based, and also in a lab I was working with in Cape Town, South Africa, we had to do a lot of work with local regulators and legislatures to try to figure out, the rules of the road, or the skies, as it were, in those cases. So that brought me to Washington, D.C. I was really fortunate to kind of be sucked into the tech policy world in the second Obama administration in the White House Office of Science and Technology. And, there, my whole job was essentially focused on asking questions about how the world ought to look given the trajectory of, technological development. And that was a really exciting position to be in. And coming out of that experience, I wanted to do more of it, essentially from a different seat, which is why I ended up at the partnership thereafter, really working with a lot of the same stakeholders that I had been exposed to and collaborated deeply with in government, but from the nonprofit side that time. So that's a little bit about my journey. But I think, essentially my passion lies in really helping society benefit from the incredible potential of technology and asking the right questions along the way, and being careful and thoughtful about that process. I think is it's a really powerful way to do that in the right ways. So
yeah, and I think that's what we kind of really need in the regulatory mindset is one that's about how do we unleash the potential of the technology, albeit safely, rather than one that's just sort of focused on saying, well, no, how do I be risk averse for the sake of being risk averse? You two obviously met in the context of the partnership in AI. Can you talk a little bit about that work and what you accomplished there?
Yeah, definitely. Joaquin, you should absolutely chime in. I mean, I think the partnership, just at its sort of fundament, is an organization that was born of the very interests you just described, Jocelyn. It was originally founded by a group of technical leaders in some of the leading companies in the Valley, and what later grew to be a global group of stakeholders, spanning all sorts of different sectors and interests as well, including advocacy organizations, other types of nonprofits and NGOs and academic institutions, with a mindset towards really coming up with practical best practices for industry and for researchers that could be applied in the product development and research and development pipeline, essentially, and a lot of the big organizations thinking about these questions. So sampling of projects, I guess, is probably a good way to describe a little bit more about our work. One of them, kind of a marquee project of ours over the last several years, at least since I started there, was called the About ML project. And it's essentially a set of documentation standards for machine learning development life cycles. So we work, essentially, the project came about because a lot of really big players in the space, and a lot of sort of leading researchers as well, working at organizations like Google, Microsoft, IBM, and some academic research labs based all over the world, had sort of stumbled upon the imperative of labeling data sets and models early on, and wanted to sort of bring practice around that to fruition within organizations. So we are working on essentially what amounts to a nutrition label for data sets and models through that project work. And it's still chugging along and I think doing really well. As far as I know, Joaquin's still on the board, so he can speak a little bit more to the current status maybe, but that's an example of the type of sort of practicable work that we were focused on at the partnership. And there are other examples too. I don't know if Joaquin, you want to throw some of those into the arena as well.
Yeah, no, of course. I'm still on the board of the partnership on AI. It's been an amazing journey. It was one of the highlights was meeting you, Terah, and working together, of course. I'll mention maybe two other projects that I think are pretty impactful. One of them, I was very deeply involved from the Facebook side but where the partnership on AI played a key role in bringing other key players, was how to enable the detection of deep fakes, right? Like manipulated media and deep fakes in particular. The better our generative models get, the more it becomes difficult or almost impossible for human beings to tell the difference between a doctored or manufactured video or an altered video or image or even sound or like whatever it is, right? And if you think about the reasons why computer vision really took off, I think to a large degree in 2012 or around 2012, they were due to the emergence of public data sets that were of high quality and highly labeled, well labeled, and of sufficient volume, right? And so Facebook, in collaboration with the Partnership on AI and maybe many partners on the Partnership on AI, worked on doing just that, on creating a very high quality data set of deepfakes. And also in conjunction with that, the other thing that fuels progress in AI often are competitions. So there was a public competition organized around that data set to see who could come up with the best algorithms to detect deepfakes. Another example I think is fascinating, and we could probably talk about it for hours, because I think the use of AI in the criminal justice system is without a doubt one of the I think flagship examples of both opportunity and concerns, right? There's the opportunity to be less biased than human beings and to keep a trace and so on, and not be affected by what you had for lunch right before you go to court.
Right.
But on the other hand, obviously, AI has incurs a huge risk of reflecting biases that exist in society. And so the Partnership on AI wrote as well a brilliant position paper on that topic. And Terah, I don't know if I can throw the ball back to you for a second here.
Sure. Yeah, that was actually one of our earliest sort of research endeavors as a collective at the partnership. We had probably close to 60 organizations spanning all those different sort of stakeholder groups that I mentioned before, contribute to what essentially amounted to a set of minimum standards that we all felt as the sort of AI and ML crossed with, socio-technical interest community really felt these tools needed to meet before being deployed in real world decision-making situations. So in a surprise to few people, none of the tools currently available in the market, at least at the time of writing of that paper, met those standards. And so the sort of implicit position was that they shouldn't be used in the wild until they were, more effective, essentially. And the primary finding of a lot of researchers, who've done a lot of deep work on this issue, even far before PAI took it up, is that a lot of these tools are trained on biased data, given the biases of the existing criminal justice system, and therefore they produce racist results essentially in sentencing guidelines. So it's a, like Joaquin mentions, really tenuous issue because there is a lot of bias in human decision making, and in very high stakes contexts like the criminal justice system, among other examples. But machines do know better than humans when the data that the machines are trained on is just as biased as they are. So that's one example of a technical quandary. So,
first of all, I find it shocking that machine learning is used in production in the criminal justice. When I think about how slow and careful we've been about the rollout of ML in things like healthcare, where lives are at stake, and it was quite stunning to me how fast it, and I think too fast it was taken up there. And at the same time, I do think I have this, maybe I'm just like a fundamentally glass half full person, but this hope that Joaquin points out, which is hey, if the fundamental issue is human bias, it seems a lot easier to scrub bias out of a data set than out of our brain cells. And so that there is hope. This was the wrong way. It's practically a textbook in the wrong way to apply AI to try to sort out these issues. But I think we shouldn't toss the baby with the bathwater. I think there's real hope here too for a way forward for criminal justice. But when we think about criminal justice, we think about the sort of social justice movement of the last 2 years, fairness, inclusion, privacy, security. These are headline issues for society, in general and for all technology. But can you talk about like a little more about why they are specifically relevant to machine learning and AI? I mean, I think the criminal justice example was very, very telling, but like give people sort of a clearer sense of what are the risks to be thoughtful about.
I think this is another topic we could probably speak about for hours, but Joaquin, especially, I think you've done a lot of work on this issue. I mean, one example that just comes to mind that the Facebook team under Joaquin's leadership was thinking deeply about was a question of the use of demographic data in ML systems. And that's an issue we took up towards the end of my tenure at the partnership in the last couple of years. But there's been a lot of evolution, I think, in the thinking of the research community and the practitioner community on these issues in the last, in those years. Essentially, it's been a really quite robustly developed open question, I think. So Joaquin, if you want to say more, I don't want to steal your thunder.
Yeah, I mean, to start, the reason societal challenges or human values like fairness, inclusion, privacy, or security become particularly urgent when we're applying AI to building all kinds of products, is that we are to a large degree automating decision making, and that decision making can be sometimes a bit trivial, the order in which you see some emojis, in your keyboard app. Maybe that's annoying if they're not ranked correctly, but not the end of the world. Criminal justice, we already talked about, but I'm thinking about even things like content moderation, or removing hate speech automatically, for example, which again can be consequential. People have the right to express outrage. People have the right to rally behind social causes, and there is a risk, and there have been public reports of certain groups in the US feeling like their voices were suppressed. The Black community has often complained that content moderation was over-policing their speech and making more mistakes on their speech than on others. So it's essential to look at these questions of fairness, inclusion, privacy, security, fairness. Now, I at the same time as I see all these risks, I think I'm also very optimistic. And the reason I'm optimistic is that we now have a very clear forcing function to ask ourselves questions that are not new. Let's remember that responsible AI is not primarily an AI issue. It's as if AI was a catalytic agent that makes old social questions urgent, right? And sort of makes us revisit them. On the question of measurement, Terah, that you just brought up, in the US, anti-discrimination law demands that industries like the finance industry or education or healthcare do perform some measurement of outcomes, who is getting loans and who is not getting loans, broken down by race. But if you look at the way this is actually implemented, it's first of all, it's contradictory. Different personal loans and mortgage loans have contradictory guidelines on how to measure and whether you should measure. And also, often if people don't self-disclose their race identity, often it's left at the discretion of the lender to decide themselves, to sort of say, well, I think I'm going to take Latinx here because that's what it felt to me, right? So you can sort of see that these things are potentially pretty biased as well, and noisy. There is a lot of work going on. Facebook and Airbnb are two examples that come to mind of two organizations that have released white papers on how to perform accurate measurement. And we also have not just AI, but in the world of cryptography and computer science, there's a secure multi-party computation approaches with shared additive secrets and fancy things like that actually offer pretty good guarantees of absolute privacy, where nobody holds all the data, but you can still aggregate it and produce much more accurate measurements. So I think I'm optimistic. I think we're asking the right questions, and I think that the technology is getting there. Now, what we need to do is we need to absolutely bring society along as we try to perform these very difficult and challenging measurements. But I see AI as a good reason to ask the right questions.
You said something interesting that I want to double click on, Joaquin, which is that, the fairness in AI is not fundamentally an AI problem. And I think that as engineers, we do have a tendency, a natural one perhaps, to think that the solution to a technology problem is more technology. And is that the path forward here, or are you trying to hinting something else?
Well, I was going to tell you a story like an engineer walks into a bar or something like that. In 2018, I was in New York City attending the first edition of the Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency Conference, which had spun out of being a workshop within the NeoRIPS conference up to that point. And I was invited to go to a bar. It's a real story. Before the night before the conference, and I was introduced to a number of people. I was completely new. This was a new audience to me, and I'm introduced to someone. We're talking. So what do you do? Well, I work at Facebook. So what are you working on right now? Well, I just made a big change. I was supporting the applied ML team. Now I'm building this responsible AI team. So what are you focusing on? Well, I'm focusing on fairness. Oh, okay, interesting. So what's your approach? And I'm like, oh, I think we're gonna ship it and get it solved this year, like this half probably. We've already, we built this FB Learner platform that everybody uses in the company. So now what we're doing is we're building tools to measure bias in the data and in model predictions within the tool. And I think we're gonna ship that and drive adoption across the company, and we'll help solve fairness. And this person, slow motion, turned back, offered their back to me, didn't talk to me again, the whole evening. And so I asked a friend, I'm like, what happened? What did I say? It's like, well, you just spoke to a philosopher, to an ethicist, and you just told them that you're going to write some code that is going to solve fairness. And then this person patiently, my other friend, educated me on the fact that fairness is a process, that you never really achieve fairness, and that there will always be contradictory, but reasonable interpretations of fairness, right? And I guess like one clear example would be something like equality of treatment. So say I'm trying to remove bad content. Do I apply the same treatment irrespective of where it comes from, right? Or do I actually take into account the history and circumstances of different groups and then aim to equalize outcomes instead, right? And you can't do both, right? And you can't say, and so going back, I'm like, oh my God, what was I doing? I was maybe inadvertently making a choice, which is a moral philosophy choice or a political science choice on behalf of zillions of users as an engineer, because the math does translate into a philosophical position, but I didn't know which, right? So zooming out, what this that was a pretty shocking experience for me, where like, oh my God, I was so wrong about this. So I think now what I think is that we need to bring many disciplines together. We need to bring computer science and math and machine learning. We need to bring legal scholars. We need to bring moral philosophers and political scientists together. And we did that at Facebook. It was a lot of fun. We hired moral philosophers into the engineering team, which was quite something to get that done, but also life-changing in many ways.
That was quite literally a engineer and a philosopher walked into a bar type of story. But I couldn't agree more with what you said, Joaquin. And I just want to point out one interesting item, which is that, this was 2018. I was at the same bar in the same conference, and it really felt like the dawn of sort of like formalized, structured conversation in the field about these issues of how we apply, essentially these human values to computing questions. And it has merely been 3 or 4 years since then. So, the questions we're trying to solve are fundamentally issues of society and humanity that have been around for ages. And it's easy to forget how young the internet is, especially when you work in businesses like ours. So, the intersection of all these issues, I totally agree with your characterization of the process as being sort of continuously asymptotic, this sort of quest towards the ultimate ends that we're trying to achieve in making the world a better or fairer place, or producing fairer outcomes by technical systems.
That's super fair. One thing we love on Zetta Bytes Live is just war stories, and I think it's easy to get kind of metaphysical on a topic like this and think about sort of frameworks and the long horizon, but like, would love to hear about just some meaningful wins, projects, features, policies, like progress that has been made even in this short span, or also lessons learned from things that didn't pan out. I mean, sometimes it's more instructive to hear about the failures than that can be springboards to future success.
Who wants to go first? I'm happy to take it if you want. Well, I've got a lot of war stories personally. I think one of the most exciting ones, actually, this had a happy ending, but it was a tough slog along the way. One of the projects I was most focused on in the federal government during my stint in previous administrations was on generating an AI policy strategy for the US federal government for the first time ever. And the sort of time period around which we started that process was 2015 or so. Even before the conference that Joaquin just mentioned had taken place, there was a lot of sort of, I would say, percolation of these issues in the computer science community. Certainly around that period, a lot of the big industrial players, especially based in the US, but also in other places around the world, had sort of converted at least the rhetoric they were using around the products they were building to really be framing their work as AI driven. It was either that year or the year after that both IBM and Google, for example, proclaimed themselves AI companies. And a lot of the other competitors that are sort of locked arms with them in the industry did the same thing shortly thereafter. And US policymakers really started scratching their heads. We had interest, from the highest, literally the highest level in government, about the question of what we should do about AI policy, given the growth of the sector over the last decade or so. So we started with a very simple question, which was, what is the government doing on this issue? And we actually, we set out to produce a research and development strategy for the US government in AI. And the first question we asked, we put out a data call to every federal agency. There's about 80 of them. I can't list them all, but there are a lot in the federal family. And we asked all of them to produce essentially some numbers about how much investment spend they were throwing against AI research and development. And this was particularly relevant for the science and technology mission-oriented agencies that actually participate or fund research and development. But we got a lot of answers back from agencies with the question, what do you consider artificial intelligence? So we had to start by just merely creating a definition that all these different parties agreed on. And that itself was almost a year-long process for us. So we were able to get there. And since then, the US government's actually produced an annual research and development strategy in AI. And it's become a lot more crystallized what we actually mean when we're trying to measure our investment as a government in this tech, but it started as a pretty uphill battle, I would say. And then, we faced these other more normative questions around policy that were also really tricky ones to define at the time as well, where we were asking questions about the future of work, labor and economy related to automation. We were asking questions about issues of fairness, accountability, transparency, and other sort of values-oriented research and development questions, and doing a lot of discussing with both the research and advocacy communities around these issues. And answers have barely been produced for any of those. So again, the continuous quest that Joaquin mentioned is very relevant here. But the policy world is getting there slowly but surely.
Yeah, I can think about a couple of war stories. There's a lot of them. A story I've told a few times, so apologies if some people have already heard it, is when we were building the Facebook portal device. This is a contraption that is pretty awesome for video conferencing. In fact, I use it all the time. One of the main features was a smart camera, which via software, via AI, would detect not just the face, but the actual, it would infer the skeletal pose of the people on the image. And it would be trained by proper cinematographers, on data from proper cinematography, on being able to zoom in, zoom out smoothly, pan, and keep everybody in the frame, right? And so if someone else enters the room, it would zoom out smoothly and sort of keep you in the frame. If you move around, it would sort of track you and all that. And luckily, we had a Black female employee who was part of the portal team. I was on the applied ML side of things, and we had people from both teams working together. And this person was testing the camera, sitting on a couch with a colleague, and she was doing the talking, but the camera would ignore her and zoom in on the guy next to her. He was a white guy, and obviously this is a pretty shocking experience when it happens to you. Of course, Joy Bolamwini and Timnit Gebru have published great research on bias in computer vision by skin tone and gender presentation, but this is something that just was happening right in front of our eyes, right? So that was a pretty painful experience, and you can see how it happens, because AI teams, even today, tend to be composed of a non-representative set of people. People like me, white guys, are going to be overrepresented, and others are going to be underrepresented, right? Obviously, it was phenomenal. It was fantastic to catch this before the device shipped, and we took measures. This person, actually, the employee who found the issue, went on to actually build a pretty amazing protocol for inclusive AI that we rolled out and adopted in the company. There's been other war stories that are maybe less dramatic, but I think very impactful in their scale, much more so than the portal camera. For example, the use of AI to detect and prevent election interference, right? In 2019, we had the biggest elections in the history of mankind in India, the India general elections, which went over many days. And I think it was over 900 million eligible voters. And the concern there was the following. The way you tackle election interference is a symbiosis, is a collaboration between AI and human reviewers, right? So you have a fixed number of human reviewers. It's not going to be enough to review all the content produced by a country like India. That's impossible, right? So obviously what the AI does is the AI prioritizes. The AI finds what is the content that is highest risk, right? And in this case, it'd be civic content or political content, right? And so that's what you want to review first. But India is a very big country with many religions and castes and ideologies. And so the fairness question there is like, well, what if there are biases in the data? What if some populations are overrepresented and some others underrepresented? Are we going to allocate those finite human review resources equitably across everyone in India? That was a pretty big concern, right? And talking to the local teams in India, they shared that demographic dimensions that are relevant when you think about equity are things like caste and religion, but we don't have caste and religion, and probably the world didn't want Facebook to necessarily try to collect or infer caste and religion, right? The harms can be bigger than what we're trying to solve here. So we ended up doing a whole bunch of research, and we decided to use region, so geographical data, and language. Not as proxies, but as related variables. And we ended up sort of analyzing the accuracy of our models broken down by region and by language to make sure that they were sort of reasonably well calibrated and comparably so that those resources were allocated fairly. So these are like two war stories. They're short to tell, but there was definitely a lot of long nights and sweat and tears.
That's amazing. I mean, it definitely speaks to a lot of people take pot shots at Facebook or Meta, but like how hard the problems are, and how sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. A lot of the choices end up being. So that's a great illustration, and I think glad you were there. I'm glad that work was done. And but maybe like sort of shifting from the global multi-billion person impact of a Meta, total other end of the telescope. Our audience here, who we serve at Zetta, is mostly founders of the earliest stage companies. 2 or 3 people, some seed funding, maybe 10 people. When you're that early, of course, if I ask Joaquin and Terah, is it too soon to be thinking? You'll say it's never too soon. I mean, that's just cliche, right? But what is the right? Sure, everybody should be thinking about it from the earliest days. But if you don't even know if your model will ever make it to production, if you are pre-MVP or you have MVP and a few design partners playing with your stuff, how do you? How much should you be thinking about this at that point of the time? You're not on the radar of policymakers. You don't have a compliance team. What's the 80-20? Like, what's the minimal effort with the biggest payoff that you can make on this type of issue?
Well, I'd say a big reason that I'm at Zetta right now is because of my interest in this question. Having been a policymaker and a regulator myself, and then worked with some of the biggest organizations thinking about technology development, it's definitely become clear to me that there is this sort of underdeveloped consideration in earlier markets for these very questions that you're describing, Jocelyn. So I'm really passionate about helping founders think through that question. And that's part of why I'm an EIR at Zetta right now. So yeah, you got my answer. It's never too early, I think, in development and production to think about the sort of broader implications of the work that you're doing. And I actually don't think there is a more relevant space to be doing that than in AI and ML in particular, partially because of all of the issues that we discussed about the compounding effects of human decision making brought by these technologies, but also because it's a really sort of constantly shifting regulatory environment that we're in right now, and a lot of developers, people like Joaquin and his colleagues in other companies and in the research community, are really, really key voices in helping shape the outcomes of policy discussions happening right now in places like Washington, D.C. and in other jurisdictions as well. So yeah, I would say to everybody who works in a startup environment or in product leadership or research and development in any size company could really benefit from having peripheral vision on the sort of public dialogue happening around these issues. And I've suffered from, this dynamic myself, as on the engineering side, having been, working in applied robotics previously. The sort of work that I described earlier around UAVs is definitely affected by policy questions. And so, part of the reason why I went to Washington after starting that project is because I really found that we actually couldn't operate without having resolved some of these key regulatory questions. And what that debate needed at the time were the technical voices of individuals who were involved in the developer community, really informing choices happening in these policy debates. So I think I know you're in a resource constrained space when you're building a company, but I would definitely add it to the list.
Joaquin, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was following process. I think the two things that I would add to suggestions for people who are starting a company. The first one would be think about the biggest disagreements you might get in the philosophy of what you build. If you are going to really need people's data for your product to work well, think about who might be the people who oppose the way you build things the most, and then make sure that you get some of those people very close to you, either as advisors or as co-founders or on your team. So surround yourself by a diversity of perspective and embrace people who are going to bring up concerns, right? Even though those are annoying. And then the second thing is closely related to that, and maybe as a consequence, start to think about the values and principles that you will have that will guide the work that you do in your company, right? Because you will get to interesting situations that will be trade-offs, right? There will be trade-offs because you're excited and you're obviously going to create a lot of value for people, but there will always be risks, right? And I want to mention a course I guess lectured at Stanford last week. It's called Principled Entrepreneurial Decisions. It's Engineering 248, if you want to look it up. And I just checked before sharing, and the syllabus is accessible to everybody. And there's a bunch of interesting readings that are open to all. So I recommend taking a look at that.
One other thing I'd add to the question you asked, Jocelyn, is just that if you believe at all that building great products is partially a function of identifying needs in the world that need to be solved, then this is also a very ripe space to be operating in, given the complexity of all the challenges related to these outcomes that we've described along the way in this conversation. So for example, data privacy concerns, you asked earlier a very good question about whether we can sort of, tech our way out of some of these technical quandaries. And I don't always think the answer to that question is yes, but there are some really promising, areas for product development, I think, in spaces of need related to data privacy, for example, where technical solutions can really bring a lot to the table in privacy preservation and other sort of areas, and so on and so forth. So, like compliance products are not sexy and interesting to most people, but they are really useful to many, many organizations, and there's a huge market there. One organization that just sort of is called to mind, mostly because we announced them as a portfolio company today. It's a company called Pimlock out of the UK, and they essentially are an ML layer that automatically reduces, PII essentially from audiovisual data. So faces are blurred in video and CCTV footage, for example, among other applications. And things like that can really help preserve privacy in the face of some of the civil liberties and privacy issues that have been risen to the fore in policy debates as well.
I think that's an excellent point, that there are definitely, for sure, some great startup ideas to be had in this space. And it's definitely a space that Zetta is really excited about. I mean, I think it actually, going all the way back to GDPR, I think we saw a whole bunch of really good startups get off the ground and make a lot of headway, just serving the need for tech companies to comply with GDPR and other companies. And I think that there's probably a whole additional generation of tech coming to help with responsible AI. Any particular ideas in that space outside of Pimlock? Congratulations on launching today, Pimlock. Any other ideas for sort of unsolved problems or pain points you see that you'd love to encourage founders to go solve?
Yeah, I want to build on what Terah just said. I think compliance by design might become a pretty big space. Regulation isn't quite there yet, but I think it's going to come very fast and very abruptly, and it's going to catch a lot of people unprepared. You mentioned privacy and data. I think that's a huge one, right? There's a few inspiring companies out there that are managing data flows for other companies in terms of sampling the data on one hand, but also managing the labeling of the data. In addition to privacy, you can go beyond. We talked about fairness and bias earlier on, right? Imagine a world where if I'm using your data to train my computer vision systems, then I know that I'm compliant because you will take care of making sure that data is not biased and you will test it, right? That'd be pretty attractive, I think, for the majority of companies that can't afford running their data pipelines. I'm also seeing a lot of interesting work in ML ops as well, in managing the training and deployment of models. If you need to have also bias checks, but also robustness and consistency and reliability checks as well. If you can guarantee that, hey, if you use my ML ops platform or suite, I'm going to take care of these things for you, I think that's pretty, that'd be pretty exciting, I think, for a lot of companies.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I want to throw it open to audience questions here. If audience members, if you want to throw a question into the chat or into the Q&A button here, I'll pose your questions to Joaquin and Terah, and to give folks a few minutes to formulate and type their questions. Let me just make this a little bit of a free-for-all for you two. Like, given foundations to use AI safely, what are, like, you know, what motivates all this? Like, calling back to where we started this is like, hey, the reason why we want to do this, why we want to do this work on responsible AI is not to shut AI down. It's just the opposite, that we want it to be safe to use AI for all kinds of problems. And so what are some of the things that you're most excited about tackling with AI once we have these good foundations?
It's a long list, I would say, but I know Joaquin holds similar interests, so I'll let him jump in on this as well. But I'm really excited by the intersection of computational science and other branches of science, essentially. So what can AI help unlock in a lot of the arenas actually that Zetta makes investments and thinks pretty deeply about, related to material science development, climate science and energy questions, biology, synthetic and otherwise. And there's been a lot of movement in the research community on a lot of related questions in recent years, really sort of unlocked by the potential that these data-driven technologies and related interfaces have brought to the equation. So I think all that's really exciting. I also just think that there has been a lot of development recently too at the sort of human AI interface as well. So we're seeing our organizations really think about questions of human augmentation in ways that we just haven't previously been able to approach, whether in physical settings or you know, in internet-based ones. And I think those are also really exciting directions for the field as well.
Yeah, on human augmentation, I think one of my favorite examples, which is a little old now, I think it's from 2016, is having ML and humans work together on finding better parameter settings for experimental nuclear fusion reactors. So the context here is that when you run experiments in nuclear fusion, you have in the order of thousands of parameters to set and configure for your experiment, right? And experiments are very costly. You can only run a few a year. So you have to think very carefully about what to try, right? And what humans are good at, nuclear physicists have a lot of domain knowledge, a lot of context. They have intuition, common sense. What AI has is an unlimited ability to process any arbitrary amount of data. And AI can actually visualize and reason in thousand-dimensional spaces in ways that humans can't, right? But AI doesn't have intuition, doesn't have common sense, doesn't know enough about physics, really, right? But you can get the best of both worlds by combining them together, right? And you can have the AI team up with the nuclear scientists or physicists in suggesting a bunch of configurations that are promising, but that maybe the human hadn't thought about. And then the human can basically look at some and say, oh, I can see what you thought about that. That doesn't make sense. Not going to work for reasons that you don't know, dear AI. But there's going to be other cases where the human is going to go, oh my God, I didn't think about that. This could be pretty powerful and pretty interesting. And maybe to add another area that I think I find very exciting. I think a few months ago, there was the cover article in The Economist was called Real-Time Economics. And what it talked about is it talked about how through instrumentation, through the internet, we now have the ability to know what's going on almost in real time. You're seeing a lot of companies right now that are working on telemetry and measurement of things like forests and you know, how the planet is evolving like day to day, right? As we think about trying to save the planet and as we think about global warming, I'm very excited about the carbon economy in general, but I'm very excited about how AI can help ingest all the data we have to create accountability and to even create almost like a true standard for, hey, who's emitting and who isn't, who's capturing and how much, etc. So I think there's just so much to be excited about.
That actually dovetails perfectly into our first question here in the chat. I think we all know how much cattle and the eating of meat contributes to the decline of the climate or damage to the climate. And I think this is a founder with the concept of, hey, could AI be used to develop alternative protein sources from plants? You know, just as if we're using AI for drug development or for materials science, you know, to develop new materials, could we be using AI to develop new plant proteins or something along those lines? Is that a good application of AI?
I think so. Yeah, I mean,
or viable, maybe. I mean, clearly.
I'd love to drill into the details, but I think generally speaking, from a little bit more of a zoomed out perspective, anything that could benefit from, a higher throughput processing mechanism could generally be benefited from AI and machine learning applications. And one, I think, somewhat related example to the question is a team of researchers I stumbled upon recently trying to create new enzymes for plastic digestion, who actually use ML as a primary tool in, basically in protein discovery and enzyme discovery, and are able to try a whole new combination of sort of cellular processes in a way that just wouldn't really normally be possible in a wet lab. So these like new simulated environments really, I think, can help with the discovery processes. And then to speak to Joaquin's, last point, I think that where human augmentation is really a critical phase is really in sort of quality assuring and testing the viability of these new scientific discoveries. And what this team was doing in the example of the enzyme discovery mechanism was actually then handing lists of these sort of new combinations to scientists who have been used to actually working with physically modeled protein structures as a way to test out the viability of the discoveries they're making. So, I'm sure the same could probably be said for synthetic meat manufacturing and other applications as well.
That's really cool. I've got another couple meaty ones here in the Q&A. Let's try to get through both of them actually in our time remaining, because I think they're both really good questions. So the first one is from Adam. He says, you both mentioned privacy several times. When we look at GDPR, and maybe I'll broaden the question, the kind of current state of data privacy regulation globally, but especially Europe and North America, are we getting this right, or are we still on the learning curve? And sort of to what degree of, I'll just read the question. Can you say how much the accepted notion of concepts such as privacy affects how we use AI to achieve fairness? So maybe, Terah, I'm sure you've thought deeply about the policy side of this, sort of where are we on the curve of getting data privacy policy right? And then to what degree is like data privacy more of a social norm that may change before other things do? Maybe that's how I interpret the second question.
Yeah, both really good questions. I'll take a strike at it by saying that, I think from a policy perspective, we are definitely still on the learning curve. And that is relevant to both the data privacy issues risen by the person asking the question, but also other issues that intersect with the types of technologies that we've been talking about and public policy questions. GDPR was really interesting because it was a sort of sector agnostic, application agnostic regulatory regime that was applied as a blanket over a host of all sorts of different technology application areas. And I think that's, it's part of what makes it effective as a regulating mechanism, but also part of what makes it really challenging in measuring compliance performance against it. A whole sort of cottage industry of, advice givers had to spring up post GDPR to help provide product teams everywhere with practicable advice about how to actually comply with the regulatory regime. So I think, there's definitely a gap in understanding that exists between enactment and practice when you're implementing any policy. But the easier you can make it on communities that a policy affects to actually adhere to them, the better designed it is, generally speaking, because it just makes, helps make the whole process more intuitive. And it ensures that people are complying for the right reasons as well, and not just, doing the bare minimum, I guess, to avoid fines and other, law enforcement measures. But yeah, I forgot the second question now. I'm so sorry, Jocelyn.
Well, let's
And Joaquin
actually
might have
maybe
perspectives here too.
No, that was great, helpful. And I actually do want to make a moment for the last question, because I think it's a pretty like a meaty one, which is when it comes to decisions with significant, from Wissam Abbas, when it comes to decisions with significant social impact, like justice, criminal justice, I assume, who to prioritize for hospice care, et cetera. In what ways can algorithmic decision making be better than humans, worse? Is there a way to combine them? And I think like this is really acute. And I actually think, Joaquin, you gave a really good example earlier. If we don't have enough human content moderators to go around for this election, how do we allocate a scarce resource in an equitable manner? Is a and the trade-off you posed, Joaquin, between, well, do you want equity of outcomes or do you want equity of treatment? Can't have them both. Like, these are fundamental hard trade-offs. Are they ones where the combination of AI and human can do better than human alone? I think is there a path there?
Yeah, I'm convinced there is a path. So you just gave the example of scale, right? We can probably make a lot more decisions per unit of time assisted with AI than without it, for sure. Whether through prioritization of human decision making, but also by using AI to create either metrics or risk scores or things like that to be consumed by humans as inputs to our own decision making. I think one exciting aspect of algorithmic decision making is that it's very easy to leave a trace, and so auditability and accountability, if we got the right mechanisms of governance, I think become easy to implement at massive scale. I think the biggest challenge of all really is governance. Like, at what point do you insert humans in the process to do audits and checks and balances, and to make sure that the humans are making the decisions that humans should be making? Yes.
Who guards the guardians? This was wonderful. I could talk to you both for hours more about these topics, and I'm sure our audience would love that too. But we are at the top of the hour, so I'll just close by thanking you both so much for sharing your wisdom with Zetta, and thanking all the audience who joined us today. All three of us are available to answer follow-up questions if we didn't get to you here live, and please do be in touch if you're working on ideas or companies in this space. We'd love to hear about it. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and thank you, team. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.